So not normally on the Criminal Assets Bureau lists, we don't hear about homes in Glenairi in South County Dublin with a guy that we've spoken about in recent times, Ciaran Sam O'Sullivan, who was brought, I think this is the first hearing brought in relation to his assets by the Criminal Assets Bureau.
Yeah, his name cropped up before, and I suppose because he's from South County Dublin, needless to say, we've kind of called him the posh protégé of Christy Kinahan Snr. He goes back a long way and seems to have criminal associations going back well over 20 years. And he was named last year in a case that involved a Chinese organised crime gang, and it was pretty much asserted that he was the link man between the Irish kind of drug gangs that were using the Chinese to launder the money, or certainly that was the case that came across, and he was seen meeting with the head of that organised crime gang, this guy, Mr. Peng, lost his case, and various goods and gold bullion and cash and all the rest of it were seized in that. It emerged that O'Sullivan himself had been the subject of what they call a Section 2 order last August, which are held in camera. So we don't get to report on them. We don't even necessarily get to know they're on. And that's basically when the Criminal Assets Bureau go in front of a judge and basically say, look, do we have a case here? And the judge makes a decision on the basis, yeah, there's something here, you can go forward. And they go on to the next stage, which is usually, it's basically to get an order so they can seize the objects or keep them seized or take control of them or get power of sale.
Freeze them, I suppose, is a lot of the cases.
Well, the Section 2 freezes them as such, and then the Section 2 then is to get possession and control, or it is really, I suppose, essentially is to have them declared the proceeds of crime, and then they can move on. And it doesn't necessarily go in order from Section 3, 4, 5, or whatever. It's sometimes they go straight to a Section 7. I can't remember exactly what that is, but sometimes people don't put up a fight. So this is the first time that it's a case that he wasn't just mentioned in as being part of someone else's case. This is one after him, and it would have come down to the searches that were carried out, I think, in 2020 that were targeting this Chinese gang, and they were searching this house in Glenairi, which is actually his aunt's house, and where he resides when he's in this country. And nothing was aired in court as yet as to exactly what property they're after or what exactly was taken. But it was heard in court that his aunt who owns the property had written a letter since to the one of the state solicitors asking for a gold bullion coin to be returned to her. So obviously there was at least one gold coin that was taken by the Criminal Assets Bureau, which the aunt is suggesting that that's actually hers and it's got nothing to do with it. It was also heard in court that she told officers that she's not going to be contesting this case. She's not named in it, but and they were looking for, basically, I mean, what happened last week, they were looking for permission to serve him the legal documents, to serve him the notice. And usually if somebody's abroad, they have to get permission from the court to make service in a foreign jurisdiction. I actually remember them doing that with Daniel Kinahan, in fact, in connection with a house seized from Jimmy Mansfield Jr., where they served him by email to I think a solicitor's office in London and maybe one in Dubai. So it's basically if they don't have to, normally if somebody was in Ireland, they'd almost have to serve them with a warrant directly, face to face is the normal way. And if they want to do it some other way, like electronically or by post, they have to go to court and get permission. Yeah. You have to make an effort, and you have to show evidence of having made an effort. I mean, with the Maguire brothers, with Owen Maguire, who wouldn't come out of his home in Dundalk that time, or sorry, in Drogheda. Yeah, there was almost comical evidence, given where a young woman would answer the door and say, "Hang on a second," and then she'd go and says, he said he's not here. I mean, he's not here. Right. There was this kind of. So eventually, they gave evidence of having just left a box of papers on his doorstep, and the judge was satisfied. Look, there's no doubt he's been served. And then I suppose the Sullivan's case, what they had was. They had an email for him, and they were allowed now to serve him via the email. Yeah. Now it was mentioned that he is in sporadic contact with his aunt. This was heard in court, and that she hadn't heard from him in a while. And while initially they said that they didn't know his whereabouts, then it was suggested that he's actually living in Spain. Yeah. And we know in the past that he's lived in Spain before, and the Netherlands and Switzerland, that he's quite a mover in that regard.
Yeah, because I mean, to go back into his background, Sam O'Sullivan is not a name that rings wild in the underworld, but he's, at least in the guards, have described him before as being somebody who is very heavily involved in the criminal underworld, but a kind of a managerial role. Certainly, we reported recently about how he was one of the main dealers of EncroChat phones when they were first set up. He was traced to an address in the mountains in the Alps, I think, and that he had an associate, a guy called Rob Nocter, who was in charge, who was the number one dealer of EncroChat phones to the French criminal underworld. And back before that, Sam O'Sullivan has had a long association with the Kinahan Cartel, was said to be somebody that Christy Kinahan Snr really favoured, that liked working with. Sam O'Sullivan is not somebody that's been linked to murders or violence, but it is the case put forward that he was one of those trusted guys, one of that could manage things and was just a bit smarter, I suppose, than your average sort of criminal. I mean, he does have those associations. I think back to the 90s is when he first sort of came on the radar.
Yeah, I mean, we've written about his arrests, and I think with John Cunningham, who major drug supplier based in Holland, and again, even in 2010, arrested as part of Operation Shovel with the Kinahans and all the rest. He's a veteran criminal, so he would have been a young man in his 20s associating with people like this. He's associated with Bernard Clancy as well, who was a lifelong pal of Christy Kinahan Snr. And he's one of the individuals that have been sanctioned by the US Office of Foreign Asset Control, based in Dubai now as well. I think, isn't he, Bernard Clancy?
He is, Bernard Clancy,
and would have had spent a lot of time in Spain as well before they kind of moved operations out to Dubai.
Yeah, I mean, I think what probably happened with the Kinahan Cartel is when they moved to Spain in the early 2000s, they had a kind of a key network of people who were working with them. At that stage, probably maybe the majority of the money was made through cannabis, through probably hash, as which is a rarity now, and they were bringing in shipments of cannabis from Morocco, really, that were being landed in Spain, and then they had a key group that were there distributing that, storing it in sort of warehouses and getting it back to Ireland one way or another, and also back to the UK. And Bernard Clancy, who was from Oliver Bond, who would have been more of a friend of Daniel Kinahan's, I suppose. Sam O'Sullivan would have been another one of them there. And they had various other people who were based in Spain. Clancy and O'Sullivan were ultimately caught with a shipment and served, I think it was a relatively short period of time in a Spanish prison. But Sam O'Sullivan would have, unlike, say, Bernard Clancy would have grown up in Oliver Bond, Sam O'Sullivan would have grown up in Glenairi, and he would have, at one stage, there was, sometime in the 90s, there was a raid on a home, and he was caught there. There was a lot of drugs, ecstasy seized and money seized, and that would have, I suppose, Sam O'Sullivan would have been there. He would have been involved in that operation. I think it was for sort of John Cunningham's overall operation, and that would have been the time in which the kind of Kinahan and John Cunningham would have really been sort of hitting the big time.
This had been Chris Casserly's kind of organisation in that part, and I think, I know Nicola recently talking about it, linked, he's been linked as well to Martin Foley and Clive Bulger, who, again, I suppose making the point that O'Sullivan being linked to Cunningham was unusual, that here you had this kid from South County Dublin who, was basically a kid at that stage, dealing with these kind of hardcore professional criminals, which is unusual when you consider like his, I suppose a relatively normal upbringing. I think he was brought up by the aunt very much so. Yeah. In this, very nice area of South County Dublin. It's not where you would normally associate sort of hardcore drug gang members to actually come from.
No, it's not. It's not. And of course, like he would have, once he was on that path, I suppose, because I think he was charged in relation to that initial seizure and then left the country, or he was at least arrested and left the country. And then I suppose he's in that lifestyle. He would spend time in Amsterdam, where Christy Kinahan Snr at that stage would have been based. And it was always said that, Christy Kinahan Sr. had a few guys that he favoured and a few of those younger guys that he didn't really fancy, like, Gary Hutch, for example. He wasn't wild about that type, but that he did like Sam O'Sullivan, who was, by all accounts, very likeable sort of guy, a bit smarter than average. And that, when they moved to Spain and started hitting the big time, O'Sullivan was right in the mix.
I suppose there is that, it's an advantage, I suppose, to have a plausible manner. Even as a journalist, let alone as a criminal. And I mean, but if you look at the stuff about the Chinese gang and those raids in 2020, it's not small time. There was when they were carried out, and this would have included where he's living at the time, one of the addresses. And now it's not just his money; it was part of those. I think 13 or 14 of the Chinese laundering group that were kind of targeted. But it was 733,000 in cash receipts, and just another, I think, 300,000 in funds that were frozen, along with cars. There was a load of designer goods as well, as usual, because they were using this Daigou system.
Yeah, explain that, because it's complicated, but it's sort of ingeniously simple as well, in a way.
Well, it's a way of moving money across borders, like specifically to China, where people say you want to buy a Rolex watch, you can't really necessarily you can't buy them in China and wherever you are.
Yeah.
So you give 20 grand to somebody and saying, look, I want this model of Rolex watch. Yeah. And you hand over your equivalent of 20 grand, or you might have the hard currency. Yeah. And then somebody at the other end in Ireland with the cash goes into whatever jewelers and buys that particular watch, and it gets sent home to you.
Yeah.
So it's essentially 20 grand has gone from China to Ireland, and vice versa. Then money is or jewellery or high value goods are going back the other direction. Now, presumably they can be moved on again and sold on again through Dubai or whatever, whether or not it's a final resting point. But, like we saw that in another case recently, in the case of Yan Fan, who is still ongoing, like legal issues going. Like she was a woman living in Ireland for like 20 years or thereabouts, but like they've linked her to a grow house operation, and they, you could see where the cab were running into trouble, saying, "Look, we have bank statements, supplied by her, but they're in Chinese now. I'm sure they were well able to get them translated, but like it's unreliable. Like there's no cooperation with the authorities like they would get, say, from other European countries, or people where there'd be kind of a working relationship. There'd be nothing like that coming from China. So in a sense, it's a good way of moving, I don't know, dark money from out of Ireland into another jurisdiction. So it comes back then in a different form.
And how does it come back to the person in Ireland then?
It probably doesn't, to be honest, because it needs to go somewhere where the cocaine that's been bought is been bought and sold. So it probably it likely ends up in somewhere like Dubai at some point and goes through a shell company and then goes through another shell company and people are able to, it comes back in through trusts and through lodgements, through, various kind of, bogey jobs or whatever the way they want to do it. I mean, there's lots of different ways, I mean, you probably find that the vast majority of Irish drug money now, if it's in Ireland, is coming through legitimate companies, and buying property or doing something, some major deals, so that, hundreds of millions, and of that, X amount of that is coming through possibly, ultimately through shell companies who got their money from the cocaine business.
Yeah, because you see, obviously, the huge risk with cash seizures, and we've seen record amounts of them over the last couple of years. I can't add them exactly up, but they've been huge. So the physical movement of cash, even in high value notes, like it's a huge risk, I think, because it has to literally be vacuum packed. A few people have to become involved. They have to get a logistics person. It has to go on. Yeah. Tends to go on boats, ferries or whatever. So there's just a huge risk of that being seized. And if a way can be done that it's, to eliminate that risk, they will take it. I suppose it's this sort of scheme where certainly some people are going in and buying. It wasn't even just Rolexes; it was mass purchases of designer clothes.
Of course. Yeah, it would be handbags and other jewelry, men's and women's jewelry. Expensive jackets, coats, that sort of thing. I mean, it's as much as you want to spend, really. I mean, it's beyond our pitiful salaries, Niall, but it's like it's a day's work for a decent cocaine dealer. Like, it's going to be nipping into some of these kind of high-end outlets to purchase objects that essentially allows them to keep a large chunk of wealth in their fist so that they can travel abroad wearing it, and you're less likely to be stopped, you know?
So, I mean, that's the beginning of those proceedings. And those cab proceedings, how long do they typically take? I mean, you're talking, if they're, I mean, it's a long piece of string, I suppose.
It is. I mean, there's one came up and there was a deal finally done, and it was a 2012 case. So that's one. I can't even remember which one.
Yeah.
It's I think it was some drug dealers down in Carlow. And basically the cash or whatever was seized was finally declared the proceeds of crime 14 years later.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, things can get delayed. I mean, you know, you would have seen, say, the likes of Mago Gately kind of trundled on there for, was it 2.5 years?
Yeah.
And that was considered relatively slow.
Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately, they didn't really have a defense. And that's still going on because they're still... The judge is waiting for information on how much mortgage payments were made since, I think, 2018 or something like that, because he wants to be able to award back a proportion of cash from the sale of their house, whichever, you know, whatever it goes for. There might be €8,000 or something to go back to Charlene Lamb, Mago's partner. So, you know, it's sometimes they go on, but it's literally a matter of just tidying up loose ends. And
because I mean, one of, for example, the case that was probably also heard the same day, was it, with Edward and Natalie Chiper? Is that how it's pronounced? Or, I mean, we were calling them Chipper for a while.
Yeah, I think somebody called them Chiper and Chipper as well. They're a Moldovan couple, so if any of the Moldovan listeners want to advise us on the best way, but I was going with Chiper. So there's no confusion.
It sounds classier,
you don't get hungry.
Anyway.
It certainly does, and they certainly like to look classy on their social media pages. Like, you know, there's plenty of posing in nice clothes and kind of wearing nice jewellery in front of fancy cars and big houses somewhere outside of Ireland. And of course, the main focus of the case against them was their own house called the White House, which is just 7 kilometres north of Drogheda in County Louth, in a kind of a very nice little Sylvan rural cul-de-sac with big electric gates, which one gate maker suggested me would cost about 20 grand to get installed.
Really? Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a lot of work done on the house. There was I forget what exactly was valued at, but I mean, there was a 171 Merc that they bought for 70,000. And there was 98,000 in various bank accounts, and I think another 5 grand in cash. And there wasn't a whole lot said about it in open court, because they kind of fought it for a while, and they were delaying it on the basis that they weren't able to get documents from Moldova to show that that the funding for their house and their lifestyle came from legitimate sources. Now, I think CAB were kind of, their patience were wearing thin. At one point, they suggested that they were looking for discovery of documents that they already had themselves, which was, they were saying, like, well, why should we give them discovery of their bank account records, which they were able to get from their own bank? So they kind of felt that this was a deliberate kind of delaying tactic, and they said as much in court, and we did a couple of stories that time. But like, we didn't know much about them. Like, they had been arrested, I think it was in 2020. There was a cannabis haul of something close to €1 million, and they both had been arrested and charged with that. But eventually those charges were dropped. But as a result of that, then you had the CAB case. And then last week it was more or less finalised, where they said the case was settled. And we know that it was pretty much... I think it was everything. They ended up pretty much losing the case, apart from something like 10% of the whatever they get for the price of the house when it goes up for auction, which probably won't happen until sometime next year, because it's not been seized straight away. It's going to be later in the year before it's handed over. So presumably this is all part of the agreement, and there was no order for costs made against them as well, which is obviously another kind of part of that. But I mean, I don't think they're small time. Like, we do know that they're linked in with Russian and Moldovan gangs involved in shipping cannabis from North Africa into Spain and Portugal, and then from there into Russia, but also into Ireland as well. This is all what was CAB's case against them. Yeah. So they're not small time, and no. They certainly. The social media was something to look at.
It was.
They really did I think we constantly describe them as the glamorous Moldovan couple.
we do. And they are.
And there's been like a certain amount of interest in this. There's been a number of these sort of kind of unknown almost, gangsters from abroad who've obviously tried to capitalize on the fact that they wouldn't be known in Ireland, and they've set up base here. And some of them at kind of I suppose, different levels of the business. Like, I mean, we briefly touched on Yan Yan Fan, but I mean, there was another chap who did a story on recently, Swiderski, and like, he was a factory worker who kept his job, like, you know, packing meat and veg, but in the meantime, he had a little grow house operation going on. Now, it didn't come out exactly like how high up or down or low down, but he seemed to be fairly hands-on in terms of renting properties and all the rest of it where people were living, and they had said they'd been recruited by him to sort of live in these houses where cannabis plants were found. And he'd bought an apartment in the block where he lived in Tullow for 186,000, so he lost that. Yeah, but it was also mentioned that he'd bought a house in Poland in the meantime for 81,000, so he still has that. So it wasn't a complete waste of time, his side hustle. No, but just, you know, I mean, and there's others. We had another chap recently who was living here under a false name, did very well. You know, he was kind of foreign holidays, again, high-end jewellery, living here under a false name, and was part and parcel of a kind of a Polish organised crime group, and based himself here in Ireland. He was caught near, I think on 2 occasions, when guards were looking for cannabis grow houses, he was found in the vicinity of the area. And this is all part of their cab against him. He was involved in a serious assault and attack by a gang of men on another gang in I think Dungannon in Northern Ireland. Yeah. And that was described in court at a bail hearing as basically a feud between 2 Polish organised crime gangs. So you mean you have these people that are taking advantage, I suppose, that they're not well known. No, initially.
And I mean, it's probably harder for the Gardaí to penetrate those sort of criminal organisations if they're of foreign origin. You know, I mean, we've seen that over in other countries as well, where sometimes they have to, you know, get police officers to come from that community to start making that penetration. And certainly that's happened in the US with the sort of wave of immigrants from places like Cuba in was it the 70s, and then other waves of immigrants as well, that they have to, you know, that they have to be policed slightly differently, and certainly they can operate under the radar. But CAB is a great equaliser, because if you spent the money, you have to show where you got it, and if you can't, you can't.
Yeah, and I mean, and that, I mean, that chap I was talking about, like, who was involved in the feud in the north of Ireland, like, he was living, his address, I think, was in County Meath, and but the reason the cab got onto him, he was stopped in Tala driving a nice Audi RS6, and had $8,000 in cash, and, you know, claimed to be working selling cars and this kind of stuff, but there was nothing, and there was no record of him on Dundee or any of this kind of stuff, so they got into him on the back of that. Yeah. So I mean, in a sense, he put his own hand up. Like, I mean, when I say he was stopped, they had to chase him. It was a pursuit. So, he pretty much put his paw up there in saying, please investigate me, in that sense.
Yeah, and of course you see as well then in other seizures that we won't go into in particular, but we see a mix of Irish and Eastern European and other nationalities. So on some level, they do all interact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously do. And I mean, and you know, I mean, there's probably a certain amount of it that, you know, there is a big population of Polish people here, and that you'll probably find that they're catering to their own community. Yeah. And then obviously some of them are quite good at it, might look for, you know, contacts to sell on products into the wider market, or vice versa, like, you know. Yeah. And I suppose if you're gangland, you know, you're gonna find that there's going to be at some point a bigger gangster than you, or you're going to have to do some kind of a deal or cooperate or whatever, or some, you know. And again, none of these gangs are terribly specialist in any one thing. Like, we know, not saying with regard to any of the cases we just talked about, but there are others that we know of who are into everything, you know, from terms of trafficking people in here to work. Yeah. They're also involved in trafficking people, you know, to work in the sex trade. And they're also involved in cocaine. They're also involved in moving guns. You know, they're also involved in you know, providing logistics for other gangs. So, I mean, a lot of them have their various income streams, I guess, and they'll use their contacts the way any business person does, in that sense. Yeah, and money always rules. That's it. I wish we had more. Yeah. Well, you never know, Eamon. Okay, thanks very much, Eamon. That was a pleasure, Niall. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.